The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Aldridge Palace as Prince Alexander made his way through the grand corridors. His footsteps echoed in the silence, each step deliberate and measured. Today marked 3 months since his father, King Edmund, had remarried Lady Victoria Harrington, a woman whose sharp wit and calculated charm had quickly earned her both admirers and enemies within the palace walls. Alexander paused outside the breakfast room, hearing voices through the heavy oak doors. His stepmother's distinctive laugh carried through the air, followed by his father's deeper chuckle. For a moment, he considered turning back, retreating to his private quarters where he could avoid another uncomfortable family gathering. But duty called, and as heir to the throne, he knew he must face whatever tension awaited him inside. The conversation stopped abruptly when he entered. King Edmund looked up from his newspaper, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. "Alexander, my boy, come, join us." Victoria sat across from the king, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around a delicate china teacup. She offered Alexander a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Good morning, father, Lady Victoria." Alexander took his usual seat at the far end of the long mahogany table. The butler, Harrison, immediately appeared at his side, pouring fresh coffee into his cup without being asked. The man had served the royal family for over 30 years and knew everyone's preferences by heart. "Victoria was just telling me about the plans for the autumn charity gala," King Edmund said, folding his newspaper and setting it aside. "She has some wonderful ideas for making it the grandest event of the season." Victoria's smile widened. "I believe in bringing a fresh perspective to these traditions. Perhaps it's time the royal family showed the people that we can be both regal and relevant." Her tone carried a subtle implication that previous galas had been somehow lacking. Alexander took a slow sip of his coffee, studying his stepmother over the rim of his cup. Lady Victoria had arrived at court 6 months ago, as part of a diplomatic delegation from the neighboring kingdom of Westmere. Within weeks, she had captured the king's attention completely. The courtship had been swift, almost scandalously so by royal standards. Many whispered that she was too young for the 58-year-old king. But at 35, Victoria was hardly a naive girl. She was a woman who knew exactly what she wanted. "What sort of fresh perspective did you have in mind?" Alexander asked, keeping his voice neutral. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her green eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "Well, for starters, I think we should invite some of the younger nobility from across Europe. Make it more of a social event for our generation, not just the usual stuffy affair with endless speeches about duty and tradition." The barb was subtle but unmistakable. Alexander felt his jaw tighten slightly. His late mother, Queen Isabella, had established the Autumn Gala 20 years ago as a way to raise funds for children's hospitals across the kingdom. It had indeed featured speeches about duty and tradition. But those speeches had helped raise millions for sick children. "The gala has always been quite successful," Alexander replied carefully. "Last year alone, we raised over £2 million for the children's hospitals." "Oh, I'm not criticizing the charitable aspect," Victoria said quickly, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I just think we could do so much more if we made it more appealing to younger donors. People with fresh money, new ideas. The old guard is lovely, of course, but they've already given what they're going to give." King Edmund nodded thoughtfully. "Victoria makes an excellent point. We do need to think about the future of these events." Alexander felt a familiar frustration building in his chest. In the 3 months since the wedding, he had watched Victoria systematically dismiss or undermine many of the traditions that his mother had established, always with a smile, always with reasonable-sounding arguments. But the intent was clear. She wanted to remake the palace in her own image. "Perhaps we could discuss this with the charity committee," Alexander suggested. "They've been organizing the gala for 2 decades. Their input might be valuable." Victoria waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, darling, committees just slow things down. Sometimes you need someone with vision to take charge and make things happen." She turned to the king. "Edmund, you understand that, don't you? After all, look how much you've accomplished by making decisive choices." The implication hung in the air like smoke. King Edmund had indeed made a decisive choice when he married Victoria, after knowing her for barely 3 months. It had been a choice that surprised everyone, including Alexander, who had learned about his father's engagement from a palace announcement rather than a personal conversation. Alexander, Victoria continued, I know this must be difficult for you. Change often is, especially when you've grown up with certain expectations about how things should be done. Her voice carried a note of condescending sympathy that made Alexander's teeth clench. But sometimes we have to let go of the past to embrace the future. The breakfast room fell silent, except for the soft ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Alexander stared at his stepmother. Processing her words, it wasn't just what she had said, but how she had said it. The implication that he was somehow stuck in the past, unable to adapt or grow. That his respect for his mother's legacy was a weakness rather than a strength. King Edmund cleared his throat uncomfortably. Victoria, perhaps we should— No, father, Alexander interrupted, his voice calm but firm. I think Lady Victoria has made her position quite clear. He stood slowly, placing his napkin beside his plate with deliberate precision. You're right about one thing, Victoria. Change can be difficult. But there's a difference between positive change and simply erasing what came before. Victoria's composure flickered for just a moment, her green eyes flashing with something that might have been annoyance or calculation. I never said anything about erasing the past, Alexander. I simply believe in progress. Progress, Alexander repeated, letting the word hang between them. And in your definition of progress, does it include respecting the work that came before? The legacy of those who built these traditions with purpose and care? The tension in the room was palpable now. Harrison had retreated to the far corner, his experienced instincts telling him to make himself as invisible as possible. King Edmund looked between his son and his new wife, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. I respect the past, Victoria said, her voice cooling slightly. But I also understand that clinging too tightly to old ways can prevent growth. Sometimes, Alexander, wisdom comes from knowing when to honor tradition and when to move beyond it. Alexander nodded slowly. You're absolutely right. Wisdom does come from knowing the difference. He paused, meeting her gaze directly. The question is whether one has enough experience and understanding to make that distinction accurately. The challenge in his words was unmistakable. Victoria had been part of the royal family for exactly 3 months. His mother had spent 25 years building relationships, understanding the delicate balance of royal duty and public service. Yet here sat Victoria, confidently dismissing decades of careful work as outdated and irrelevant. Victoria's smile never wavered. But there was steel behind it now. Experience is valuable. Certainly. But sometimes fresh eyes can see opportunities that familiarity has obscured. After all, wasn't it Einstein who said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results? Actually, Alexander replied quietly, there's no evidence Einstein ever said that. It's one of those quotes that gets attributed to him without any historical basis, rather like many assumptions people make without taking the time to verify their accuracy. The parallel was clear, and Victoria's cheeks flushed slightly. King Edmund shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sensing the undercurrent of conflict even if he didn't fully understand its source. Well, Victoria said, her voice maintaining its pleasant tone despite the obvious irritation in her eyes. I suppose we all make mistakes sometimes. The important thing is being open to learning and growing. Indeed, Alexander agreed. Learning is crucial, especially learning about the responsibilities that come with privilege and position. Understanding that respect must be earned, not simply assumed. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Victoria set down her teacup with a soft clink that seemed unusually loud in the tense silence. When she looked up, her expression had hardened into something more calculating. You know, Alexander, she said, her voice taking on a different quality. I've been thinking about your situation quite a bit lately. Here you are, 32 years old, heir to the throne, and yet still so, dependent on the past for guidance. Most men your age have learned to forge their own path by now. King Edmund frowned. Victoria, I don't think, but she continued, her gaze fixed on Alexander. I mean, when I look at other royal heirs across Europe, I see men who have embraced their roles, who have married and started families, who have shown real leadership, and then I wonder what might be holding someone back from taking those steps forward. The cutting remark hit its target with surgical precision. Alexander's personal life had indeed been a source of speculation in the press and among the nobility. His last serious relationship had ended 2 years ago, and his single status was often discussed in the tabloids. More painfully, it was a source of private worry for Alexander himself, who sometimes wondered if his dedication to duty had cost him the chance at the kind of love his parents had shared. But what made Victoria's words particularly cruel was her timing and venue. To bring up such a personal matter at the breakfast table, in front of his father, was a calculated humiliation. It was designed to make him feel small, defensive, somehow inadequate compared to her vision of what a modern royal should be. The silence stretched between them, charged with electricity. Alexander felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in, of being trapped between his duty to his father and his own dignity. Victoria watched him with the satisfied expression of someone who believed they had landed a decisive blow. But instead of the defensive reaction she clearly expected, Alexander simply smiled. It was a quiet, genuine smile that seemed to transform his entire demeanor. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured, with an underlying current of something that made Victoria shift uncomfortably in her chair. "You're right, Victoria," he said, rising from his chair once more. "Real leadership does require courage. The courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. The courage to protect what matters, even when others don't understand its value." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "And sometimes, the courage to respond to cutting remarks with the dignity they don't deserve. But that one's position demands." With that, he turned to his father. "If you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with the Children's Hospital Board this morning. We're planning some improvements to the pediatric wing, continuing Mother's work, as it happens." He bowed slightly to the king, nodded politely to Victoria, and walked toward the door. As he reached the threshold, he paused and looked back. "Oh, and Victoria? The next time you'd like to discuss my personal life, perhaps we could do so privately. I'd hate for you to feel embarrassed when I explain exactly why some conversations are better left for more appropriate moments." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Victoria and King Edmund alone in the breakfast room. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the continued ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant sound of Alexander's footsteps fading down the marble corridor. Victoria stared at the closed door, her perfectly composed expression finally cracking to reveal something closer to shock. In her calculated attempt to embarrass and diminish Alexander, she had instead revealed her own lack of understanding about the subtle rules that governed royal behavior. Worse, she had done so in front of the king, who was now looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. King Edmund slowly folded his newspaper and set it aside. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful but carried an edge that Victoria had never heard before. "My dear," he said quietly, "perhaps we should discuss the difference between modernizing traditions and simply dismissing them." But Victoria was no longer listening. Her mind was already racing ahead, calculating her next move in what she was beginning to realize was a far more complex game than she had initially understood. Prince Alexander had just shown her that beneath his polite exterior lay something much more formidable than she had anticipated. The battle for influence within the palace walls had truly begun. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation in the breakfast room, and the atmosphere in Aldridge Palace had grown increasingly tense. Alexander had thrown himself into his royal duties with renewed vigor, spending long hours with various charitable organizations and government committees. His schedule became so packed that he rarely crossed paths with Victoria except during formal occasions when proper protocol demanded their presence together. Victoria, meanwhile, had been busy building her own network of influence within the court. She hosted intimate dinner parties for younger members of the nobility, organized charity luncheons that subtly positioned her as a modernizing force, and cultivated relationships with key palace staff members. Her charm offensive was methodical and effective, earning her supporters who saw her as a breath of fresh air in the sometimes stodgy world of royal tradition. The real test came when the Royal Council convened to discuss the upcoming autumn gala. The meeting was held in the palace's blue drawing room, a magnificent space adorned with priceless tapestries and portraits of Alexander's ancestors. Present were King Edmund, Alexander, Victoria, Lord Chancellor Whitmore, Treasury Secretary Mrs. Pemberton, and Lady Margaret Ashford, who had chaired the Charity Committee for the past 15 years. The theme this year, Lady Ashford was explaining, consulting her meticulously organized notes, will be Healing Through Hope, focusing on the expansion of mental health services for children. We've already received commitments from several major donors, and the children's choir from St. Catherine's Hospital will perform. Victoria listened politely, her hands folded in her lap, but Alexander could see the barely concealed impatience in her expression. When Lady Ashford finished her presentation, Victoria smiled graciously before speaking. Lady Ashford, your dedication to this cause is truly admirable, she began, her voice warm and appreciative. However, I've been giving considerable thought to how we might maximize the impact of this event, and I believe we're missing a significant opportunity. She stood and moved to the window, her silk dress catching the afternoon light as she turned to address the room. The traditional format appeals to the same donor base year after year. While their continued support is valuable, we're essentially preaching to the choir, if you'll forgive the expression. Lord Whitmore adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. What exactly are you proposing, Lady Victoria? A complete reimagining of the event, Victoria replied, her voice gaining energy as she spoke. Instead of another formal dinner with speeches and traditional entertainment, we could host something that would actually attract media attention and younger philanthropists. A themed masquerade ball, perhaps, with contemporary music and interactive fundraising activities. Lady Ashford's expression grew concerned. But the children from the hospital look forward to performing each year. It's become a tradition that gives them hope and purpose. Victoria waved a dismissive hand. We could certainly include them in some capacity. But we shouldn't let sentimentality prevent us from maximizing our fundraising potential. A masquerade ball would generate the kind of social media buzz that attracts international attention and younger donors. Alexander had been listening in silence, but now he spoke up. Victoria, the gala isn't meant to be a social media event. It's about connecting donors directly with the cause they're supporting. When people hear those children sing, when they meet the families who have benefited from the hospital's services, that creates lasting emotional connections that sustain giving long after the party ends. That's a lovely sentiment, Alexander, Victoria replied, her tone suggesting she found his perspective charmingly naive. But we live in a digital age. People's attention spans are shorter, and their philanthropic options are numerous. We need to compete for their interest, not assume they'll simply show up out of duty. King Edmund had been listening thoughtfully to the exchange. Victoria raises some interesting points about modernizing our approach. She does, Alexander agreed. But let me share some actual data from last year's event. He opened a folder he had brought to the meeting. 68% of our major donors cited the children's performance as the moment that convinced them to increase their annual giving. The average donation from first-time attendees was 40% higher when they had direct interaction with hospital staff and patients. Mrs. Pemberton nodded approvingly. Those are impressive statistics, Your Highness. Furthermore, Alexander continued, the traditional format allows us to keep overhead costs extremely low. 93% of every pound raised goes directly to patient care. A masquerade ball with contemporary entertainment would require significant additional expenses for staging, security, and equipment. Victoria's smile grew cooler. Of course, one could argue that investing in better marketing and presentation might yield higher overall returns, even with increased costs. One could argue that, Alexander replied evenly. But one would need evidence to support such an argument. Do you have examples of similar events that have achieved better results with this approach? The question caught Victoria off guard. She had based her proposal on intuition and her desire to make a splash, not on careful research. Her pause before responding was telling. Well, I haven't conducted a comprehensive study, she admitted. But surely innovation requires some willingness to take calculated risks. Absolutely. Alexander agreed. But this isn't our money to risk. It's funding for sick children. That requires a different standard of decision-making. Lady Ashford cleared her throat delicately. If I may, I've actually researched similar events across Europe this past year. The most successful charity galas in terms of funds raised per guest all maintained traditional formats, focused on direct connection with the cause. Victoria's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Being contradicted by data was one thing, but being corrected by someone she clearly viewed as part of the old guard was evidently more irritating. Lady Ashford, Victoria said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. I appreciate your research, but I wonder if you're entirely the right person to evaluate modern fundraising approaches. After all, you've been doing things the same way for 15 years. Sometimes fresh perspective requires fresh leadership. The room went very quiet. Lady Ashford was not just the charity committee chair. She was the widow of a war hero and one of the most respected members of the nobility. Her work with children's charities was legendary, and she had personally raised over £50 million for various causes during her decades of service. Alexander felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. Victoria had just crossed a line that revealed either stunning ignorance of palace dynamics or breathtaking arrogance. Perhaps both. I'm sorry, Alexander said, his voice deceptively calm, but I want to make sure I understand correctly. Are you suggesting that Lady Ashford should step down from her position? Victoria realized immediately that she had miscalculated, but she was too committed to her position to back down gracefully. I'm simply suggesting that sometimes organizations benefit from new leadership and new ideas. I see. Alexander turned to address the room, but his words were clearly directed at Victoria. Lady Ashford, would you mind sharing some details about your background for those who might not be fully familiar with your qualifications? Lady Ashford looked uncomfortable but replied graciously. Well, I suppose I've been involved in charity work for about 30 years now. I helped establish the Children's Wing at Royal General Hospital, founded the scholarship program for disadvantaged youth, and served on the boards of several international children's organizations. And your educational background? I have a degree in social work from Cambridge and a master's in non-profit management from Oxford. Alexander nodded. And Victoria, perhaps you could share your experience in charity management and fundraising? It was a surgical strike, delivered with perfect politeness but devastating precision. Victoria had no such background. Her expertise lay in diplomacy and social climbing, not in the complex world of charitable fundraising. I may not have formal training in charity work, Victoria replied, her voice growing defensive despite her efforts to remain composed. But I have extensive experience in event planning and social coordination. Event planning is certainly valuable, Alexander agreed, though I imagine there are significant differences between planning social gatherings and managing events designed to raise funds for critically ill children. The distinction was subtle but cutting. Alexander had just reduced Victoria's proposal from visionary leadership to party planning, and he had done so in front of the entire royal council. Victoria's composure finally cracked. Her cheeks flushed, and when she spoke again, her carefully modulated tone gave way to something sharper and more revealing. You know what, Alexander? I think your real problem isn't with my qualifications or my ideas. I think you simply can't bear the thought of anyone changing anything your precious mother established. Her voice carried a bitter edge now. You cling to these traditions like security blankets, afraid to risk anything that might suggest she wasn't perfect. The room fell into shocked silence. To invoke Queen Isabella's memory in such a dismissive, almost mocking way was beyond inappropriate. It was cruel, calculated to wound, and it revealed the depth of frustration that had been building beneath Victoria's polished exterior. But instead of the anger Victoria clearly expected, Alexander simply looked sad. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the silent room. Victoria, my mother wasn't perfect. She was human, with all the flaws that entails. but she was wise enough to build something larger than herself. These traditions aren't monuments to her ego. They're systems that work. They help sick children get better treatment. They provide hope to families facing unimaginable challenges. He paused, looking directly at her with an expression that was neither angry nor defensive, but deeply disappointed. The tragedy here isn't that you want to change things. Change can be good, necessary even. The tragedy is that you've never bothered to understand what you're trying to change or why it matters. You see traditions as obstacles to your ambition, rather than achievements to build upon. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but Alexander continued. More troubling is your willingness to dismiss people like Lady Ashford, who has dedicated her life to service, simply because she represents continuity rather than novelty. That's not innovation, Victoria. That's just arrogance dressed up in modern clothes. King Edmund finally intervened, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the throne. I think we've heard enough for today. We'll table this discussion and reconvene next week, after everyone has had time to reflect. As the council members began to file out, Victoria remained seated, her face pale except for 2 bright spots of color on her cheeks. She had intended to establish her authority and vision, but instead she had revealed her inexperience and, worse, her lack of respect for the very institution she had married into. Alexander gathered his papers slowly, giving her one last look that held neither triumph nor malice. Only a kind of weary resignation. Victoria, he said quietly, so only she could hear, the crown isn't a prize to be won, it's a responsibility to be earned. Until you understand that distinction, you'll never understand why these traditions matter, or why the people who maintain them deserve respect rather than dismissal. He left the room, followed by the other council members, leaving Victoria alone with her thoughts and the growing realization that she had significantly underestimated both Alexander and the complexity of the world she was trying to remake. Outside in the corridor, Lady Ashford approached Alexander with a gentle smile. "Thank you, Your Highness," she said simply. "But more than defending me, thank you for defending what matters." "Thank you," Alexander nodded, but his expression remained troubled. The confrontation had been necessary, but it had also revealed just how deep the divisions within his family had become. Victoria wasn't simply a difficult stepmother. She was someone whose fundamental values seemed incompatible with the principles that guided royal service. As he walked back to his office, Alexander wondered whether his father would see this incident as a clarifying moment, or as evidence that his son was unwilling to embrace change. The answer to that question would determine not just the future of the autumn gala, but the future of the monarchy itself. The week following the council meeting brought an unusual quiet to Aldridge Palace. King Edmund had retreated to his private study, spending long hours reviewing documents and taking meetings with advisors that didn't include either Alexander or Victoria. The staff moved through their duties with the careful efficiency that came from years of experience navigating royal family tensions, but even the most seasoned servants could feel the weight of unspoken conflict hanging over the palace. Alexander maintained his rigorous schedule, but those closest to him noticed the strain beginning to show. His private secretary, James Morrison, had worked for the prince for 8 years and had never seen him so quietly troubled. During their morning briefings, Alexander would sometimes pause mid-sentence, staring out the window as if wrestling with thoughts too complex for words. Victoria, meanwhile, had adopted a strategy of strategic visibility. She appeared at public events with renewed energy, her smile never brighter or more confident. To outside observers, she seemed to be thriving in her role as queen consort. But palace insiders noted that she had begun holding private meetings with certain staff members, and her public appearances were increasingly independent of the royal family's traditional coordinated approach. The crisis came to a head on a Thursday afternoon when Alexander returned from a hospital visit to find his father waiting in his private sitting room. King Edmund looked older than his 58 years, the weight of recent events clearly taking its toll. "We need to talk," the king said without preamble. Alexander loosened his tie and sat down across from his father, noting the formal way Edmund held himself. This wasn't going to be a casual conversation between father and son. "Victoria came to see me this morning," King Edmund began. "She's very upset about what happened in the council meeting." "I imagine she is," Alexander replied carefully. "She feels that you deliberately humiliated her in front of the other council members." That you used your position and experience to make her look foolish. Alexander considered his response carefully. Father. Victoria made claims about fundraising and suggested removing Lady Ashford from her position. When I asked for her qualifications to make such recommendations, I wasn't trying to humiliate her. I was trying to understand the basis for her proposals. King Edmund sighed deeply. Alexander, I know you have concerns about Victoria. Some of them may even be justified, but she's my wife now, and she's going to be queen consort for many years to come. The two of you need to find a way to work together. I'm willing to work with anyone who shares our commitment to the crown's responsibilities, Alexander said. But Victoria seems to view the monarchy as a platform for her personal agenda rather than as an institution of service. That's a harsh judgment, is it? Alexander leaned forward. Father, in 3 months, she suggested dismantling or drastically altering every major charitable initiative Mother established. She's dismissed experienced advisors like Lady Ashford. She's made cutting personal remarks designed to undermine my authority. At what point do we acknowledge that this isn't about modernization versus tradition? This is about someone who fundamentally misunderstands what we're supposed to be doing here. King Edmund was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man torn between love and duty. Victoria believes you resent her presence here, that you've never accepted our marriage and are looking for ways to undermine her position. She's half right, Alexander admitted. I do have reservations about decisions that affect the monarchy being made impulsively. But I've never tried to undermine her position. I've simply tried to protect institutions that serve important purposes. And what about her position as my wife? Does that serve an important purpose? The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Alexander could see the pain in his father's eyes, the genuine love he felt for Victoria competing with growing doubts about the wisdom of their rushed marriage. Father, your happiness matters enormously to me. But the crown doesn't belong to us personally. We're temporary custodians of something much larger than our individual desires. Before King Edmund could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. James Morrison entered, his face flushed with unusual urgency. Your Majesty, Your Highness, I apologize for the interruption, but there's been a development that requires immediate attention. What kind of development? Alexander asked. James looked uncomfortable. Lady Victoria has called an impromptu press conference for this afternoon. She's announced that she'll be sharing her vision for modernizing the royal family's charitable work. The silence that followed was profound. King Edmund's face went very pale, while Alexander felt a cold knot form in his stomach. An unauthorized press conference by a member of the royal family was unprecedented and potentially catastrophic. Did she clear this with the communications office? King Edmund asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. No, Your Majesty. The first we heard of it was when reporters began calling for confirmation 20 minutes ago. Alexander stood abruptly. We need to stop this. A rogue press conference could damage relationships with our charity partners, confuse our messaging, and undermine years of carefully built trust. It's too late, James said grimly. The conference is scheduled to begin in an hour, and several major news outlets are already setting up. King Edmund closed his eyes, the weight of the situation clearly overwhelming him. When he opened them again, there was a new resolution in his expression. Find Victoria, he said to James. Tell her I need to see her immediately. She's already left for the venue, Your Majesty. The conference is being held at the Meridian Hotel. Alexander felt anger and frustration building inside him, but he forced himself to think strategically. What's our best option here? Can we get there in time to join the conference and provide some control over the messaging? 1. It would be risky, James replied. If you appear together, but your messages conflict, it could create an even bigger story. King Edmund stood slowly, his decision made. Alexander, I want you to go to the hotel. Don't try to stop the conference, but be prepared to address any questions about royal family unity. James, get our communications director there as well. What about you? Alexander asked. I'm going to have a very serious conversation with my wife when she returns. Alexander changed into a formal suit and was driven to the Meridian Hotel with unprecedented speed. As his car pulled up to the venue, he could see the gathered press corps and felt his heart sink. This wasn't a small, controlled event. Victoria had organized something designed to make a major statement. He entered through a side entrance and found Victoria in a private room, making final preparations. She looked up when he entered, her expression shifting from surprise to defiance. "Alexander, I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Victoria, what are you doing? You can't hold an unauthorized press conference about royal policy." "I'm not discussing policy," she replied coolly. "I'm sharing my personal vision for how the royal family might evolve its charitable work. As Queen Consort, I believe I have not only the right, but the obligation to contribute to these discussions. Through proper channels, yes. Not through surprise media statements that bypass established protocols." Victoria turned to face him fully, and Alexander could see something dangerous in her expression. "You know what your problem is, Alexander. You think you own the monarchy. You think your birth order gives you the right to control everyone and everything connected to the crown. I think my position comes with responsibilities, yes, including the responsibility to prevent damage to institutions that serve the public good. Or maybe," Victoria said, her voice growing sharper, "you're terrified that someone might actually improve on your mother's legacy. Maybe you've spent so many years playing the dutiful son that you can't imagine anyone doing things better." Alexander felt the familiar flash of anger, but this time, he didn't try to contain it completely. "Victoria, my mother built programs that have saved thousands of lives and improved countless more. Your entire contribution so far has been criticizing her work while offering nothing but vague promises of modernization." "My contribution?" Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Alexander, I've raised more money in 3 months than your previous charity events have raised in years. I've brought new energy and new donors to causes that were becoming stagnant. But you can't see any of that because you're too busy protecting your precious traditions." "What money?" Alexander asked sharply. Victoria's pause was telling. "Well, I've identified potential donors who could contribute significantly more if we approach them correctly. Potential donors aren't actual donations, Victoria. And identifying people isn't the same as raising money." There was a knock at the door, and one of Victoria's assistants entered. "Lady Victoria, we're ready to begin." Victoria straightened her jacket and moved toward the door, but Alexander stepped into her path. "Victoria, please. Think about what you're doing. Once you walk out there and start making statements about royal policy without authorization, there's no taking it back. This will create a crisis that affects everyone." For just a moment, Victoria's expression wavered, and Alexander thought he saw a flicker of uncertainty. But then her chin lifted with renewed determination. "Alexander, I've spent 3 months trying to work within your systems and being blocked at every turn. Sometimes you have to be willing to take action rather than waiting for permission from committees and advisors." She stepped around him and headed for the door, but Alexander's voice stopped her. "Victoria." She turned back, and he looked directly into her eyes. "When this backfires, and it will, don't expect me to clean up the mess. And don't expect my father to protect you from the consequences of decisions you made without consulting anyone." "I don't need protection from anyone," Victoria replied. "Least of all, from someone who's spent his entire life hiding behind tradition because he's too afraid to actually lead." With that, she walked out of the room, leaving Alexander alone with the sound of his own heartbeat and the growing murmur of the assembled press. Through the partially open door, he could hear Victoria beginning her remarks, her voice confident and carrying clearly through the hotel's sound system. She spoke about bringing fresh energy to royal charitable work, about the need for innovation in fundraising approaches, and about her vision for making the monarchy more relevant to younger generations. To most of the listening audience, her words probably sounded reasonable, even inspiring. But Alexander could hear the subtle criticisms of existing programs, the implied promises of dramatic changes, and the dangerous suggestion that she spoke for the royal family as a whole. His phone buzzed with a text from James. "Communications director is here. Do you want to make a statement after she's finished?" Alexander thought carefully before responding. Whatever he said now would either escalate the crisis or help contain it. Victoria had created this situation, but how he handled it would determine whether it became a temporary embarrassment or a lasting wound to the monarchy's credibility. He typed back, "Prepare a brief statement emphasizing that Lady Victoria's remarks represent her personal perspectives and that all official royal charitable policies continue to be coordinated through established channels." It wasn't a complete repudiation of Victoria's conference, but it was a clear signal that she wasn't speaking for the royal family as an institution. It was the minimum response necessary to protect the crown's authority while leaving room for damage control later. As he waited for Victoria to finish her remarks, Alexander reflected on the irony of the situation. Victoria had accused him of being afraid to lead, but leadership sometimes meant knowing when not to act impulsively. It meant understanding that true authority came from trust and respect, not from dramatic gestures designed to capture attention. When Victoria finished her conference and the press began dispersing, Alexander emerged to make his brief statement. His words were measured and diplomatic, but the message was unmistakable. Victoria had acted independently, and her views didn't necessarily represent official royal policy. The car ride back to the palace was conducted in silence, with Victoria staring out one window and Alexander out the other. Both understood that something fundamental had shifted. The careful balance that had maintained peace within the royal family for the past 3 months had been irreparably disrupted. When they arrived at the palace, King Edmund was waiting in the entrance hall, his expression unreadable. He looked at both of them for a long moment before speaking. "Victoria, my study. Now. Alexander, please join us in 10 minutes." As Alexander watched his father and stepmother disappear down the corridor, he realized that the real confrontation was just beginning. Victoria's press conference had forced a crisis that could no longer be managed through careful diplomacy and private conversations. Decisions would have to be made, and those decisions would determine not just the future of his father's marriage, but the future of the monarchy itself. The palace had always been a place where personal desires intersected with public duty, where private relationships were shaped by constitutional responsibilities. Today, that intersection had become a collision point, and Alexander suspected that when the dust settled, the royal family would look very different than it had that morning. 10 minutes later, he walked toward his father's study, knowing that whatever happened next would define his relationship with Victoria, his father's happiness, and his own path toward the throne. The quiet corridors of Aldridge Palace had seen many crises over the centuries, but few had carried such potential to reshape the institution they all served. As he reached the study door, Alexander could hear raised voices inside, not shouting but the kind of intense, hushed argument that suggested fundamental disagreements could no longer be contained. He knocked once and entered, ready to face whatever consequences Victoria's bold response had set in motion. The standoff that had begun with cutting remarks over breakfast had evolved into something much larger, and now it would finally be resolved one way or another.